Siona God, hello all. Oshtisahia, good evening, and Wado, thank you for watching. So this is day 9, part B of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. Hopefully y'all are enjoying the holiday, and you may from time to time hear my hubster and our son doing a small reno upstairs as their Father's Day thing. Western and non-Western societies. Slavery did not die out quietly of its own accord. It went down fighting to the bitter end, and it lost only because Europeans had gunpowder weapons first. The advance of European imperialism around the world marketed the retreat of the slave trade and then of slavery itself. The British stamped out slavery not only throughout the British Empire, which included 1/4 of the world, whether measured in land or people, but also by its pressures and its actions against other nations. For example, the British Navy entered Brazilian waters in 1849 and destroyed Brazilian ships that had been used in the slave trade. The British government pressured the Ottoman Empire into banning the African slave trade and later threatened to start boarding Ottoman ships in the Mediterranean if that empire did not do a better job of policing the ban. Still later, Americans stamped out slavery in the Philippines. The Dutch stamped it out in Indonesia, the Russians in Central Asia, the French in their West African and Caribbean colonies. Germans in their East Africa colonies often hanged slave traders on the spot when they caught them in the act. No non-Western nation or civilization shared this animosity toward slavery that began to develop in the Western world in the late 18th century, reached its peak in the 19th century, and continued to fuel the anti-slavery efforts that were still necessary in much of Africa and the Middle East on into the first half of the 20th century. This worldwide struggle went on for more than a century because the non-Western world in general resisted and evaded all efforts to get them to root out this institution that was an integral part of their economies and societies. When the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire first raised the issue of abolishing slavery with the Sultan in 1840, he reported this response: "I have been heard with extreme astonishment, accompanied with a smile at a proposition for destroying an institution closely interwoven with the frame of society in this country, and intimately connected with the law and with the habits and even the religion of all classes, from the Sultan himself on down to the lowest peasant." Similarly, the Maoris of New Zealand responded to comments on their enslavement of some fellow Polynesians on other islands by saying, "We took possession in accordance with our customs, and we caught all the people. Not one escaped. Some ran away from us. These we killed, and others we killed. But what of that? I was in accordance with our customs." When British Foreign Secretary Palmerston, Palmerston, sought in 1841 through his representative consul, Consul, Atkins Hamerton, 1M, to get the ruler of Zanzibar to end the flourishing slave trade there, this was the response. When Palmerston continued to press for an end to the slave trade, said pleaded that if he acceded to British demands, his subjects would withdraw their loyalty from him and support another claimant to the throne. And was he not looked up to by all Arabs, generally, in quote, as the person who should protect and guarantee for them their dearest interest, the right to carry on the slave trade, end quote. He reminded Hamerton that Arabs were not like the English and the other European people who were always reading and writing and were unable to understand the anti-slavery viewpoint. The British obsession with it was quite inexplicable to them. In short, what was so patently wrong about slavery in the eyes of Western civilization of the past 2 centuries was almost incomprehensible to many non-Westerners. Eventually, some Westernized elites or intellectuals in non-Western societies also became embarrassed about slavery, but these societies developed no such fervent anti-slavery movements as those which propelled successive European and European offshoot societies to ban this practice for themselves and to stamp it out among others. In the Western world, hostility to slavery was by no means confined to elites. When a British ship stopped at Zanzibar in the 19th century, it was considered quote-unquote dangerous to let British sailors go ashore for fear that they would riot if they saw the slave market there. In the years leading up to the abolition of slavery, that's crazy. In the years leading up to abolition of slavery in Brazil, soldiers and their officers, end quote, no longer believed in legitimacy of slavery, end quote, and so dragged their feet when assigned the task of recapturing runaway slaves. Soldiers continued to be sent to places where slaves were on the loose, but were not afraid to express their unwillingness to capture fugitives. The commander of an army unit sent to a community in Sao Paulo early in 1888 agreed to maintain order, but openly declined to capture slaves. In places runaways were loitering on the roads, refusing to work, army units sent to control them did nothing. Not all Brazilian soldiers refused orders to control or recapture slaves, but there was enough opposition to this rule that a formal request was made to the civil authorities by the military to relieve them of this distasteful duty. With public opinion increasingly hostile to the continuation of slavery, and many Brazilians keenly aware of and painfully embarrassed by the fact that their country was the last one in the Western world to still have slavery, the plantation owners were increasingly isolated, and some began freeing their slaves themselves in anticipation of official emancipation. Well, I mean, I guess that is an option. And in some cases, in hopes of retaining these workers as employees. Thus, when the official date of emancipation arrived in Brazil, most slaves were already free, either having been freed by plantation owners or having simply left the plantations on their own, secure in the knowledge that the surrounding population was not likely to cooperate in their recapture and return. Still, when the official day of emancipation arrived, it was a cause of national celebration. The novelist Machado, M-A-C-H-A-D-O, de Assis, A-S-S-I-S, recalled that the celebrations following the passage of the Golden Law were, in quotes, the only instance of popular delirium that I can remember ever having seen, end quote. One Sao Paulo newspaper described the crowds that gathered to celebrate, end quote. To try to describe the splendor of that festival of joy, to tell everything that happened, falls beyond our abilities. Never has this capital seen such multitudinous and unanimous enthusiasm, end quote. Perhaps at no other period of history was the contrast between the Western and the non-Western world greater. Here was the scene when the Ottoman Empire announced the end of the slave trade. In 1855, when the Sultan's firman, F-I-R-M-A-N, was read out in Mecca and Jeddah, J-E-D-D-A, it caused a revolution. Turkish officials, including the Kadi, who read the firman, were murdered, the garrison shut, and Mecca was in a state of revolt until the Porte repealed the obnoxious order, and when the Governor General of the Hedza, H-E-D-J-A-Z, issued orders on 25 February 1860, forbidding the slave trade in all Turkish ports in the Red Sea. There was great excitement and fear of the recurrence of the 1855 violence, I bet. There was no Ottoman cruiser in the Red Sea capable of giving effect to this order, and Turkish officials were too frightened to enforce it. Although the slave trade was formally abolished in the Ottoman Empire under pressure from the British government, slavery itself continued. As of 1891, the imperial palace purchased 11 slave girls for its harem, as others in the Ottoman Empire purchased women as concubines. What? Typically white women from a region near the Caucasus, C-A-U-C-A-S-U-S, and the Black Sea, known as Circassia, C-I-R-C-A-S-S-I-A, even though every nation in the Western world had by then outlawed slavery. Not only the Turks accepted such slavery, so did the Circassians. Mothers often groomed their daughters, for this role, and sold them into what was considered to be a desirable situation, at least by comparison with what was available in Circassia. British Foreign Secretary Palmerston, P-A-L-M-E-R-S-T-O-N, said, end quote, the only complaint we have ever heard from the Circassians has been against our attempts to stop the traffic, end quote. That's insane. Contrary to the, end quote, myths to live by, end quote, created by Alex Haley and others, Africans were by no means the innocents portrayed in Roots. Wow. Baffled as to why white men were coming in and taking their people away in chains. On the contrary, wow, the region of West Africa from which Kunta Kinte supposedly came was one of the great slave trading regions of the continent. Before, during, and after the white men had arrived. Before the white men had arrived, y'all. It was the Africans who enslaved their fellow Africans, selling some of these slaves to Europeans or to Arabs and keeping others for themselves. Even at the peak of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans retained more slaves for themselves than they sent to the Western Hemisphere. This pattern was not confined to West Africa, for which most slaves were sent to the Western Hemisphere. In East Africa, the Maasai, M-A-S-A-I, were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. What? As late as 1891, it was reported that, end quote, M-A-N-Y-U-E-M-A, Maniuema, slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere, end quote. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika, Tanganyika, to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. What? Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. What? Shut the front door, dude. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. Shut up. What? The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. Ooh. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe as the Western Hemisphere and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, Nyasaland, the Ngoni and the Yao, Ngoni and Yao, swaggered over and terrorized other tribes in Uganda. The Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro, Nyoro, and Hima, Hima, of Ankole, Ankole, enslaved Toro, Toro, women and children. The Tutsi dominated, Tutsi, the Hutu, Hutu, in Rwanda, Ruanda. The Maasai, the Masai, lorded it over. The Kikuyu, Kikuyu, and Kamba, Kamba, and the latter in turn held the Ndorobo, Ndorobo, in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience. Oh, man. That this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Brion Davis pointed out that, end quote, Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, end quote, and that, in quotes, as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior, end quote. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who brought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. Slavery was destroyed within the United States at staggering costs in blood and treasure, but the struggle was over within a few ghastly years of warfare. Nevertheless, the Civil War was the bloodiest war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, and more Americans were killed in that war than in any other war in the country's history. But this was a highly atypical, indeed unique way to end slavery. In most of the rest of the world, unremitted efforts to destroy the institution of slavery went on for more than a century on 1,000 shifting fronts, and in the face of determined and ingenious efforts to continue the trade in human beings. Within the British Empire, the abolition of slavery was accompanied by the payment of compensation to slave owners for what was legally the confiscation of their property. This cost the British government $20 million, a huge sum in the 19th century, about 5% of the nation's annual output. A similar plan to have the federal government of the United States buy up the slaves and then set them free was proposed in Congress, but was never implemented. The cost of emancipating the millions of slaves in the United States would have been more than half the annual national output, but still less than the economic cost of the Civil War. Quite aside from the cost in blood and lives and legacy of lasting bitterness in the South, growing out of its defeat and widespread destruction, is suffered during that conflict. You know how they're asking for reparations? Okay. So if they are actually looking to see if they were going to pay or whatever, just like they did in the British, within the British Empire, to purchase the slaves back and then set them free, right? So you understand that that would literally be what, I don't know, when was it, 18 something or whatever, I don't know. So what a slave would cost at that time, do you know? That's probably like, what, I don't know, is it like $100 now or something? I have no idea. So here you go, here's your reparations, right? Like, come on, you know? Jeepers. Okay, so this is insane, so think about it. And this is not now, this was back then. So imagine how much money it would be for the national output or whatever. The cost of emancipating the millions of slaves in the United States would have been more than half the annual national output. You can't even fast forward and say, okay, well now, right? No, because you're not going to do inflation like that and all that kind of stuff, right? You just take it on back, and then they'd get like, what, pennies in comparison, but still less than the economic cost of the Civil War, which is insane to me. That's crazy. And then people are like him-hawing about how much it costs now to go to war and all that. I mean, this is insane. It's about the equivalent, I would think, of the Civil War. Quite aside from the cost in blood and lives and the legacy of lasting bitterness in the South growing out of its defeat and the widespread destruction it suffered during that conflict. That's just incredible to me. Anyway, let's see. While the British could simply abolish slavery in their Western Hemisphere colonies, they faced a more daunting and longer-lasting task of patrolling the Atlantic off the coast of Africa in order to prevent slave ships of various nationalities, not just white folks now, but anyway, from continuing to supply slaves illegally. Even during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain continued to keep some of its warships on patrol of West Africa. Moreover, such patrols likewise tried to interdict the shipments of slaves from East Africa through the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Don't go hang, you any good chance to meet again. Love you, mean it.